Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Scuttlebutt. Before we dive into the episode, we are very proud to welcome and celebrate our first sponsor. D&D Metal Recycling and Auto Salvage began as a small hauling and used auto parts operation in the Pittsburgh area in the late 1970s and has grown into a full-service metal recycling company with two locations, Lawrenceville and Tarentum. These are state-of-the-art scrapyards with deep roots in the community and a strong commitment to the service of their customers. D&D accepts all types of metal, both ferrous and non-ferrous, that may be generated by industrial manufacturing, construction and demolition, small commercial entities, as well as individual customers. They have a wide variety of material handling equipment and are capable of managing any job in a timely and efficient manner. You can contact them for quotes and availability at dndautosalvage.com. That's D&D autosalvage.com. Thank you, D&D, for supporting this podcast. And now on with the show.
Basically, since 2013, the embedding system has withered up and died. So really, I mean, if you compare kind of the state of access that the military provides journalists today, when we have these kind of much more limited, smaller advisory contingents in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places, it's nothing compared to what it was back when U.S. troops were slugging it out on a daily basis, and reporters could pretty much go and see almost all of it.
Welcome, everyone, to the Scuttlebutt. I'm your host, Sean Hall, the Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. Our mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. Our program, The Scuttlebutt, was created to cover recent military headlines and topics to help bridge the military-civilian divide. And I'm really excited for all of our guests today. A couple you may have heard in a previous episode of The Scuttlebutt, but I'm going to go around the room and let everybody introduce themselves. First up, I'd like to, Catherine, welcome back to The Scuttlebutt.
Hi, thanks for having me. Excited to be back because finally maybe we're getting into a little bit of my expertise. We're talking about journalism a little bit.
Very much. And we're going to get to that. I'm so excited for this. John, yourself?
John Hawes, and I'm a 19-year active duty soldier, and I served in some of the area that we're going to be talking about today.
Thank you, John. And Wes, welcome to the Scuttlebutt for the first time.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And Wes is the author of the recently released book, The Hardest Place. He is sort of the inspiration for the title of this episode, which is War Journalism. We're going to be diving into a bit of Wes's background and then talking about The Hardest Place, which you can find at any major retailer. I am into this book and it is incredible. I'm going to say that right off the bat, but we're going to talk about it in just a little bit. And if you'd be so kind, if you have anything to say about the Scuttlebutt or would like to talk about any of the topics that we talk about here today, you can like, share, subscribe, ring the bell on YouTube, and make sure that you email me at Sean, that's SHAUN, at veteransbreakfastclub.org. So we're going to go right into our first segment here, which is usually sort of our word or phrase of the week. And something that we're going to be talking about a lot is the PESH. Now, I don't know if our audience has heard of the PESH before, but the PESH is a region in Afghanistan, and it's the basis for Wes's book, The Hardest Place. I thought I'd have John and Wes, who both spent time in the PESH, talk to us about that region, sort of paint a picture of what that looks like, because I had a very different idea of what it was when I first heard about it. John, do you want to start?
Absolutely. So the PESH is a region in Kunar province, border Nuristan province. It's the northeastern corner of Afghanistan, and it's the foothills of the Himalayas, the same mountain range that Everest and stuff is in. This is a finger off of that. So it's incredibly remote, rugged. Your average mountains are somewhere between anywhere from 7,000 to 14,000 feet there. And it's small little valleys, all with really wild raging rivers standing between all of these mountains.
Wes, when you were there for the first time, did you expect it to be as sort of rugged as it is?
I'll say the thing that surprised me most is how green it is, especially in the summer. A lot of Afghanistan is very dry and brown and arid, but up in the Pech Valley and its little tributary valleys, you just have this incredible vegetation. There are these evergreen oak forests on the lower slopes, and then higher up, kind of out of sight from the valley floor, but you go on these kind of foot patrols higher up, or when guys like John would go on air assault missions, might wind up in these big conifer forests full of pines and firs and cedars that, a lot of guys describing them, seeing them for the first time, would say that they felt like they were in the Pacific Northwest, or like they were on Endor, the moon from Return of the Jedi.
This is a place that you would want to vacation. Like, it sounds just really beautiful.
It is a gorgeous place. And it's actually a place that, back in like the 1970s, there were kind of like ski resorts and hunting lodges up there for, for wealthy Afghans, members of the Afghan royal family. And, Peace Corps volunteers in the 1970s who were doing their volunteer time in Kabul, they would go hang out up in Kunar and Nuristan, go hiking.
Wow. And another term that I want to sort of define here is you see this a lot in the books, and I've heard it a lot in researching military bases, is COBs and FOBs. And what is the difference between the two?
Sure. So these are both terms for military outposts. FOB stands for Forward Operating Base, and COP stands for Combat Outpost. There's not really a firm line between the two, but in general, a FOB is a larger place and a COP is a smaller place. There are various other terms you might hear interchangeably almost with COP. An OP or an observation post in one place might later be renamed to COP. Something might be called a patrol base or a fire base one year and then be renamed to COP later on. But yeah, basically a FOB is a bigger place and a COP is a smaller place.
So the FOBs come out of the COPs? The COPs are established first and then?
Sometimes.
Okay.
There's sort of, how it happened was different in different parts of the country. But often, a place that began very small would grow over time into something larger, into a more established FOB. And then it might act as a hub for satellite COPs nearby.
Okay. Thanks for that. So with those terms in mind, what we want to do is we want to talk with Wes here about being a military affairs reporter. This gives you a lot of access, it seems, to getting into these COPs and FOBs and into units embedded and being able to talk with soldiers, go on missions with them. I guess my first question is, where are you from and why did you decide to do this?
Sure. So I'm from Watertown, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. I always was interested in wars and conflicts as a kid. I mean, I'm not sure where that comes from. I'm not a military family or anything like that, but it's just kind of a built-in interest since I was a little kid. And 9/11 happened when I was in 8th grade, and I just got really hooked on the war in Afghanistan, reading everything I could find about it. We actually had, when I was in middle school, within the first few months after 9/11, there was an NPR reporter named Sarah Chase who came and talked to my middle school class, where she had also gone to this middle school some years before, about her experiences covering the initial U.S. invasion and the fall of the Taliban. I just got fascinated with it. When I got to college, I thought the obvious kind of like tried and trodden path to go see these wars was I started ROTC. I figured, go become an Army officer. But then I quickly had just a different opportunity appear to start going and freelancing over in these wars, initially in Iraq and then in Afghanistan, at the height of, what you were alluding to a minute ago, the embedding system, which is kind of a thing that doesn't really exist anymore, but that the Bush administration instituted really in 2003 and kept going strong for about a decade until 2013 was when it started to fade away during the second term of the Obama administration. That really gave journalists from all kinds of outlets, everything from big national news outlets like the New York Times and CNN and so on, to small town newspapers from places that might have a National Guard unit mobilized, to freelancers like myself. Really amazing access to go and visit and cover most types of U.S. military forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. There were certain types of units that were off limits. You're not going to go visit SEAL Team 6 or the Ranger Regiment. But other than that, I mean, I was going out on patrols with Green Berets when I was 21 years old on my first trip to Afghanistan. And it was pretty much if you asked for it, they'd send you there. You'd say, I want to go visit 1327 Infantry in the Patch. The Army Public Affairs people would, find a way to get you there. It might take a little while. You were kind of at the mercy of flights like anybody else traveling within the military ecosystem in Afghanistan. but it was quite the system and quite the experience. And although my sort of embedded reporting forms only a fairly small part of the book, it wound up being a really important jumping off point for everything else, for kind of allowing me to see the place and meet the first people who then wound up introducing me to other people who introduced me to other people who introduced me to other people.
Hmm. Now, in middle school, or even into college, did you think that you'd end up in an area as kinetic as the Pesh?
So my first trip to Iraq was in 2007 during the surge in Iraq, and what actually, if you look back on kind of the charts of it, was the all-time peak of violence in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
Although it wasn't obvious at the time, and it seemed like things might keep going up. So I think Iraq is a very different war from Afghanistan, and the Pesh is a very different place from any area of operations in Iraq. But it wasn't much of an easing into it. It was like my first summer when I was 19 in Baghdad, I was visiting infantry units that were out dealing with IEDs and firefights and so on. It was 3 years after that I first visited the Pesh, and it was very surprising to me. It was very different because of how beautiful it was and how rugged it was, as we've mentioned, but also because of the type of fighting. I mean, it was everywhere else that I'd gone in Iraq and Afghanistan, really, these guys were facing a war of IEDs. Where you were out patrolling, kind of showing the flag, showing your presence in villages or neighborhoods of a city, and kind of waiting to be attacked a lot of the time, waiting to be attacked by kind of an unseen enemy. Now, in the Pesh by 2010, there was just an unbelievable amount of fighting. There was the amount of ordnance that was being expended on both sides really was very striking. I mean, I'm pretty sure I saw more artillery being fired in a few weeks in the Pesh in the summer of 2010 than in all my other embeds with 30 other infantry battalions in different parts of Iraq and Afghanistan combined ever. Because that was that was the nature of the terrain necessitated it. You couldn't fight there without quite a lot of firepower. And also, the enemy had been drawn into this place and were fighting very hard for it. And they would amass a lot of stuff, to fire at an outpost on a daily basis. I remember just being, my first few days at this place, Cop, Michigan, at the mouth of the Korengal Valley, where a company of the 1327 Infantry Battalion from the 101st Airborne was living. And they were, sucking down these 3 or 4 times a day, these big attacks from the enemy up in the mountains, who could see every inch of their outpost essentially from in this kind of fishbowl position. And I didn't realize that recoilless rifles were still a thing. I associated that with kind of Korea and Vietnam. But then you got recoilless rifle shells, exploding on this base. There was an AGS-17, Soviet-made automatic grenade launcher that was bothering them from time to time from up in the mountains. But something that was very striking was that despite this massive amount of firepower that was being expended on both sides, by 2010, I think this will probably be a little bit in contrast to John's experience when these outposts were just being set up and they were very kind of nascent things. By 2010, they were really built up. They were these little concrete fortresses. And so, it's not that it wasn't dangerous on these outposts. I mean, at Cop, Michigan, they'd had a mechanic killed a few weeks before I visited, and there were guys who were wounded on the base during that visit of mine. But it was such a science, such a drill that they had down of responding to contact, and there were so many fortifications that it really felt like the U.S. guys were not at the same kind of risk that they'd been in a few years earlier, when these outposts were much more precarious little positions that had just been established. And similarly, it felt like the Taliban in the hills were not at a huge amount of risk, despite the amount of ordnance being thrown at them, because they had a really long time to figure out, okay, from the moment we kick off an attack, it's going to be X minutes and X seconds until these guys get to their mortars and the 60 millimeter and 81 millimeter and 120 millimeter mortar shells start falling. That takes this amount of time. And then it takes X amount of time after that for the howitzer shells to start falling. And then it takes X amount of time after that for the Apaches to arrive, and X amount of time after that before we can expect a satellite guided bomb on our head. And so it really felt like they had it down to a science too. They knew exactly when to skedaddle and go back into their caves and tunnels and so on. And you came away with the very strong impression, or at least I did, that by this point in the war, nearly a decade into U.S. involvement in this part of the country, and about 4 years into kind of the very serious like counterinsurgency outpost approach up there, the people who were having the toughest go of it were the people who lived there.
Yeah.
And that each of these little outposts, which had been established to kind of, the idea had been that they would be a little bubble of security from the insurgency that would kind of protect people from the insurgency around the outpost, people who lived in the villages. Mm-hmm. Instead, they kind of were almost like a bubble of danger by this point, because they were drawing in enemy activity, drawing in attacks and rocket attacks. And, people would just get caught in the crossfire. They'd get caught, a mortar round would fall short, a Taliban rocket would fall short. And so the people who lived there were the people who were dying. And they just, by this point, I think were sort of very cold to the presence of both opposing sides.
And I definitely want to dive into that more. And this idea, this great picture that you just painted, that's what I mean by kinetic. There was a lot of fighting going on, and that's something that has always sort of fascinated me by a military affairs reporter. Is John enlisted. John said, "I'm going to sign this check. Or this contract. I'm going off. I'm going to fight for the country, and I'm going to put my life on the line." In any way that you ask me to. Whereas I feel like the decision that you've made to I'm going to go report on what's going on puts you in just as much danger of kidnapping or being injured or killed. And I'm interested as to why you made that decision. And did you when you made it, was it like you got there and you're like, whoa, I don't know what I just got myself into?
I'll see. My first trip to Iraq was very, it was almost surreal. I mean, kind of flying into Baghdad airport and then taking the big bus to the Green Zone, this big armored vehicle they called a Rhino. It was very strange, but I would say nothing really surprised me. I mean, like I said, I was a big nerd growing up, reading every book about Vietnam I could ever get my hands on. Mm-hmm. So no, I wouldn't say that that I ever felt kind of like overwhelmed or out of my depth, or like I was in something that I wasn't expecting. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, something to bear in mind is, I was sharing risks with the soldiers I was embedded with, but my trips were short. I'd go home, I'd leave, I'd go back to, some nice place in Kabul or Baghdad and recuperate and take my notes. So in that sense, very different, and a much more relaxed environment and approach for me than for the guys who are just, they're doing their 6 or 7 or 15 or 16 months. And, you get a couple weeks of R&R at some point in the middle, and that's about it.
And John, I want to pop over to you real quick. We talked about this a bit before we started recording. Was you had an embedded reporter in your unit, and I'm also interested in you're with your combat buddies. You've trained. There's this brotherhood amongst all of you. You have this reporter that comes in, sort of an outsider. How does that feel? How do you integrate someone like that in, and then also trust them with what's going on in your life at that point?
It's funny that you say that, because we kind of had I feel like an exception to the rule. So we're told that we had this reporter coming in, and this guy wanted to go on a couple patrols with us. And I was a recon team leader. I was in charge of a kill, what we called a kill team. I had snipers and 4 observers, and we went out on these long patrols. And we're like, how's this guy going to keep up? He just got in country, and they're like, oh, he's got his own body armor and stuff. And we've been training, and the terrain is still kicking our butt. Mm-hmm. And I'm just like, who's this guy? Well, the guy ended up being John Krakauer, who's climbed Everest, and so he shows up. He's, I think he was around 50 years old at the time, but he was in better shape than all of us. Mm-hmm. So literally from the first patrol or two, he proved himself. Just this guy was used to roughing it. He's climbed way harder mountains than we were. He bought his own body armor, and we're still huffing and puffing going up some of these goat trails, going up mountains, and he's barely breaking a sweat. So I feel like I kind of had an exception to the rule. The guy that I spent the most time with was a highly conditioned, mountaineering, expert. And so he ended up not being really any issue at all with this. And we actually ended up being able to bond over that, sharing just tips and techniques and stories on just climbing mountains and just, roughing it in the outdoors, because that's all we were doing. We was just living in the mountains.
Awesome.
Well, Wes, do they John mentioned that, the journalist he had with him was prepped, but like, do they prep you? How much do they prep you before, you get embedded? I mean, do they give you any like training, or this is what to expect, or you have to be able to do this physical thing? Like, how are you prepped to go over there?
I mean, there's no they. I was a freelancer, so I just showed up and was in it.
Wow.
So no, nothing like that in my case. I mean, it was just a matter of you kind of would show up to these units and you would kind of have to figure out what your boundaries were and what kind of stuff you were comfortable doing, and make sure not to do anything where you felt like you would be a liability, because the moment you were a liability of some kind, I mean, that's it. You're not gonna be having any more of a good experience reporting on that unit. And if there's any little thing you can bring to the table that makes you useful in some way, or just a net positive in any sense. I mean, whether that's just I mean, I often found that, especially back in the era kind of before smartphones and everything, out in these places, it could be kind of a source of explanation of the bigger war to guys who are very focused on their little patch of the war, and on just doing their job in that little patch. If you've been just came from another battalion down farther along the border, or another battalion somewhere else in the country, that could just be kind of a useful and interesting perspective for guys. And you also could sometimes be an outside ear that they can bend, who's not in their chain of command, who's a little familiar with the war. And I found, especially sometimes for, platoon leaders, company commanders, battalion commanders, it definitely sometimes felt like they kind of enjoyed that. Especially in places, like out in the Petch, where it's that kind of leadership job is a very lonely job. It's not like being at a big base in Baghdad where there's 6 battalions and everybody has, all the company commanders can go chat with each other or something like that. It sometimes felt like, you could be a little bit of a sounding board to some degree, and you could kind of help fill in a little bit about what was happening in other parts of the conflict.
Well, it sounds like you had pretty much whatever access you needed to the unit that you were embedded with. So it makes me wonder then, when you would leave and go to collect your notes and, write your pieces and things like that, when yourself and other reporters are embedded with these units, does the military then have to look at what you saw and are going to disseminate out to the public to make sure there's nothing like confidential or anything like that? Or is it just, hey, this is what you saw, go with it?
No, I mean, I give huge credit to the Pentagon for, in this era anyway, for not doing any kind of censorship in any form, on embedded reporters. I mean, there were certain guidelines that you had to sign before you visited, and they were pretty common sense stuff. I mean, it was stuff like, don't report on human intelligence and signals intelligence, like the sources of information. Don't report on, if somebody gets killed, like you're not going to publish that name until the family has been notified. I mean, pretty common sense stuff. And then beyond that, no, and then nobody would ever ask to review what you'd written before it went out or anything like that. I mean, which, as a journalist, you certainly wouldn't have permitted or allowed yourself to be in a situation where they would ask for something like that.
And that's a level of access too, that like, I'm sitting here thinking about my daily life as a reporter, which is obviously much less exciting, covering, city council and local politics and what have you. But like, that's a level of access that sometimes you don't even get as a reporter in the everyday world, covering just like normal issues here in the United States. So the fact that the military had permitted this in this time, I just like kind of want listeners to understand that how amazing that is, that like everything they were seeing from these embedded reporters is 100% factual, because you didn't have to really take anything away from it.
Sure, and it's unfortunately a thing of the past. I mean, over the past, basically since 2013, the embedding system has withered up and died. I mean, I think initially because of decisions that the Obama administration made in its second term, when it was uncomfortable with the news that was coming out of Afghanistan, didn't want people to see so much of it, or think and talk so much about it. And then I think that was also very convenient for the Trump administration. And it certainly did not, resume or facilitate any more access. So really, I mean, if you compare kind of the state of access that the military provides journalists today, when we have these kind of much more limited, smaller advisory contingents in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places, it's nothing compared to what it was back when U.S. troops were slugging it out on a daily basis, and reporters could pretty much go and see almost all of it, with the exception of the kind of the intelligence and special operations night rate components.
What a lucky, in a way, a lucky chance, like lucky time for you to dive into it, Wes. John, which way do you prefer that to be as a veteran in Afghanistan? Do you prefer to have more access for reporters? Did you feel like sort of like, let's tamp it down a bit? Like, what did you feel was better?
Honestly, I'm more for the more access, and I've always been, I don't know, I'll say like more black and white, and I'm not one to like hide anything or embellish anything. And if reporters are going to be there and they're going to report factually and tell you how it is without, some sort of political bias or, one way or the other, I'm all for that. The more news, the better, the more detail, the better. That's kind of where I fall in with it.
And I should mention that John appears in the book The Outpost, which is out by Jake Tapper. And that leads me to sort of the tower of books, Wes, that you have behind you, and the thought of, were there other authors and journalists that had gone through the Pesh, gone through Afghanistan, that you sort of looked up to, that you read about, that you thought, boy, this is something I definitely want to do?
Absolutely, and I'll mention. I think part of the value of embedded journalism, which again, embedded journalism is only one small part of covering a war. If an outlet is just doing embedded journalism and only covering kind of the U.S. from the inside the U.S. military perspective, that's just one perspective on very complicated conflicts. So, if you look at in the New York Times or somewhere back at the height of these wars, they had people embedding, and they also had people just out reporting unilaterally, just going out and talking to people, people covering the Iraqi government and the Afghan government, people covering civilian life. And reporters who were doing all of that, I think, were really essential, not just for explaining what was happening at the time, but for forming a part of the historical record. And so I was really building off in writing in essentially trying to write a story of what happened over the course of 20 years in this one part of Afghanistan. One of the very first things I would do is I would go and read everything that had been written by colleagues and older colleagues who had been there earlier in the war. And in the Pesh, there was a lot of it. I mean, because for the same reasons that I described earlier about how dramatic the fighting was, and how dramatic the scenery was, the Pesh had kind of acted as a magnet for reporters. In particular, this one tributary valley of the Pesh called the Korengal, which was an extraordinarily dangerous and stark kind of place. And a lot of embedded reporters had passed through there. It was also the case that things got going up in the Pesh and surrounding areas as far as U.S. counterinsurgency involvement. Guys on the ground out doing patrols and going up into the mountains in significant numbers, much earlier than in many other parts of the country. By the time the Obama administration took office in January 2009, and doubled and then tripled the number of U.S. troops in the country from about 33,000 when Obama took office to about 100,000 a couple years later. That's the point when U.S. troops started building outposts in little rural districts in most parts of the south and east of the country for the surge. But in the Pesh, they were already well into that process. In fact, in the Pesh, U.S. units were already closing outposts that they had built a few years earlier, and had realized were no longer useful, or had not fulfilled their purpose. So there was already a long history by 2010 of U.S. involvement up there, which is kind of what first interested me about the place. I mean, it was like these little outposts had been there for so long that nobody could really tell you when or how they got there. I mean, I remember being at Cop, Michigan, and nobody could really tell you, the company commander there. It's not that it's his job to know where these outposts came from. It's really not an essential part of their job. But it was striking that they kind of say, well, outpost was here when I got here. It was here when the guy before me got here. Pretty sure it was here when the guy before that got here. So it's kind of, I don't know. It's always been here. And I was really interested by that, and kind of trying to rewind the tape and figure out how each of these outposts how and why each had first been built, and and when even could be very hard to pin down. I mean, there was one fire base at Scuttlebutt, the first place that U.S. troops had set up in Kunar. It took me a couple of years to really figure out the circumstances under which that place had been set up, because it had been initially set up in the spring of 2002, just about 6 or 7 months after 9/11, by SEAL Team 6 and CIA guys, who obviously they didn't have any embedded reporter with them or anything like that, nor were they particularly inclined right off the bat to talk to reporters or historians. But that became kind of the task was, well, let's just figure out the outline here of what's the timeline. When did each of these places get set up and why? By tracking it back and talking to those first people who were there.
Well, a lot of it was after Tora Bora, whenever we almost caught Osama bin Laden, correct?
That's right. That's what first brought U.S. forces up into the Pesh. And this wasn't really obvious anymore by 2010. I mean, by 2010, U.S. forces were fighting kind of a daily slugfest with local insurgents for the most part, and with some, and with Taliban who were coming in from across the border in Pakistan, but essentially with a local insurgency. Now, none of that existed in 2001, 2002. And the Taliban was not strong in Kunar before 9/11. It had a pretty weak presence there. But what brought U.S. forces up into the province in the spring of 2002 was the Joint Special Operations Command, SEAL Team 6 and Delta Force, and the CIA guys that they were working with. They had kind of swung and missed at bin Laden in the Tora Bora Mountains in the next province to the south in December of 2001. Bin Laden had gotten away, and they were trying to pick his trail up again. And it turns out, we know in retrospect that he did in fact go to Kunar, to a place called the Shigal Valley, which is kind of next door to the Pesh. And that's where bin Laden spent his first 6 months or so, 6 to 9 months after Tora Bora. And so trying to follow him was what brought these special operators and intelligence guys up there in early 2002. And as they started to spread out in the province in the summer of 2002, poking around and asking questions, and driving pickup trucks and ATVs up into the various valleys. But they didn't pick up his trail. It's only in retrospect that we know they were kind of on the right track. But they didn't pick it up. And then the mission kind of snowballed from there in kind of little incremental changes until it got to this kind of big counterinsurgency monster that you saw in 2010 that seemed to have just kind of achieved this very violent stalemate with the Taliban.
Do you think that the U.S. Pushing into that region helped to escalate the violence in that? It brought the Taliban into that region as well? That was sort of inevitable?
Yeah, I absolutely do think it did that. In Kunar, it definitely had that effect. You can see this in a lot of different ways. I'll give the example of the Korengal Valley, which it's a tributary that flows into the Pesh from the south. And it's a place where U.S. troops wound up spending 4 years living in little outposts, losing 40 plus guys in pretty intense combat, a couple of helicopters shot down. The place where the movie Restrepo was filmed by the documentarian Tim Hetherington and reporter Sebastian Younger. It's where the movie Lone Survivor takes place. The Korengal is a place that U.S. forces kind of stumbled into a conflict that they weren't aware that they were being dragged into, and they were being used for purposes that they didn't understand. This is something that I kind of came to understand by talking to the Green Berets, who were kind of the first guys to go and fight in there back in 2003, really, and 2004, and by talking to their interpreters, by talking to local people who, were reflecting back on the situation. But essentially, U.S. forces got sucked into a commercial war over timber, over cedar, which they did not know that that's what was happening to them. But the Korengal Valley and the Korengali tribe, they have a lot of cedar. They have these beautiful reserves of cedar trees, Himalayan cedars, up on their upper slopes of their mountains. And they, key people in the tribe had become pretty wealthy off of that in the decades leading up to 2001. But they relied on kind of commercial middlemen in the Kunar Valley floor to buy their timber and then sell it to a Pakistani timber mafia across the border, who then would get it to its ultimate destination, which is, ultra-rich Arabs in the Persian Gulf, for whom this Kunari cedar had acquired kind of a cachet in the 1980s as a way of funding the jihad against the Soviets, because it's this beautiful wood, it smells good, it's rot resistant, it's bug resistant, and it had this sheen of coming from a place where you were helping fund the jihad against the Soviets. And that's how this kind of cedar, the machinery of the cedar trade had started rolling. But in order to get the wood from the Korengal, to the Gulf, The first step was the Korengallis relied on these timber barons who lived in the Kunar Valley, the lowlands of the province. And in the aftermath of the fall of the Taliban in 2001 and the U.S. intervention, a lot of these timber barons, these lowland timber barons, became the initial figures in the U.S.-backed, internationally backed government. They became, the police chief of the province, the governor of the province, the border police chief of the province, things like that in kind of the first couple of years. And they essentially used those positions to lobby to make the timber trade illegal, so that the Karzai government actually banned the timber trade altogether. And what this did, by criminalizing the timber trade, the timber trade didn't stop. It never stopped. If anything, it accelerated. But what this did was it criminalized the Korengali side of it, right? And it allowed these lowland timber barons to change the terms of their deals, to say, okay, we're going to be paying less for your timber now, and you don't have a say in it because we're the government. And if you argue, we can bring in this U.S. Special Forces team and tell them that you harbored an Al-Qaeda guy last year or something like that, and just make life difficult for you. And the Korengalis reacted by going to the Taliban, who had not been in the Korengal Valley previously, and essentially bringing them in as their muscle to counteract the Americans, who were these timber barons' muscle. And this is the dynamic that brings these two outside forces, into combat, into this very intense combat in the Korengal Valley. And you have a series of U.S. Green Beret teams early in the war that make very fateful decisions about whether they're going to engage with this or not. There's a pair of Green Beret teams up in the patch in 2004, living at what was then a very small outpost called Blessing, that later grew to be a little bit of a bigger base. And these two teams, for the first one, they were National Guard guys. They were a little older, a little more mature, and they actually made the decision. They didn't understand what was going on in the Korengal as far as the timber trade, but they had got a vibe that they were being used somehow, and that it was complicated, and it would be better if they didn't stick their noses into it. And so this National Guard Green Beret team from Utah, they kind of made the very deliberate decision of, we're going to leave the Korengal alone. Then they were replaced a little later in the year by an active duty Green Beret team out of Fort Bragg, who were looking at all the same reports from informants and everything, and reached totally the opposite conclusion of, hey, the Korengal is where the bad guys are at. Korengal is where the boogeyman lives. We're going to be going up there and getting into fights. That's the place to go to fight the enemy, which I think is a really natural impulse for U.S. combat units, but one that in this case, unrestrained, really set a snowball rolling that wound up being very, very costly.
Boy, a lot of this stuff is not anything that I think bleeds down to the civilian, knowledge of what was going on really in Afghanistan. Catherine, did you ever catch any wind of like the history of this?
No, not at all. And that is, I guess, just kind of speaks to the importance of, Wes, the amount of times you were there and the importance of the research that you've done, because you talked a lot about, being a part of documenting the history of it, which I think is so important. But like, you just gave me a history lesson of stuff that even as somebody that thought that I had kind of kept up with what was going on, I had no idea. So I think in general, everything you just said and all the information that you brought to like just speaks to like how important the work of reporters is, and the reporters that were there at the time to be able to document this and bring this back, because how would people have known otherwise unless you were there or you were part of the military, really?
Yeah, I mean, and I'll just, going off of that, I mean, I don't want to give the impression that I understood those dynamics at the time when I first was up there in 2010. I absolutely didn't. I didn't know anything more than, the units that I was embedded with, who themselves, only understood kind of the bare surface of this kind of backstory that I'm describing, which I think is a big part of the problem. Units would deploy, and they would only know what, they'd get a 2-week turnover period with the unit before them, and that's all they'd get. And it often would be pretty focused on kind of the basics of how do you fight and survive up here. And even the battalion intelligence shop or the battalion commander would be getting really only the very bare bones of whatever the unit before them had learned. And even if they'd been getting the full picture of what the unit before them had learned, that would only be scratching the surface of kind of the reality of what's going on in the place, because they'd only had a year, a year to learn about it. So, it took me a lot of time doing absolutely nothing else to kind of unspool this history and figure out some of the finer points of it, with the benefit of a lot of hindsight and with the benefit of being able to talk to anybody that I wanted to talk to who was willing to talk to me,
Yeah, because I'd imagine you didn't go there with the intent to write a thoroughly researched book at the end of this. I mean, you probably went there with the intent to cover, like, what was going on with the unit you were embedded with the first time, or to just give people a sense of that, I would imagine.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I just, when I first visited the Pesh, the trip was no different from trips I was taking to, all kinds of other parts of Afghanistan that same summer, the summer of President Obama's surge. I mean, I had spent chunks of that summer in a place called Sangin down in the south with Royal Marine Commandos, which was an absolutely terrifying place. I mean, a place where really the kind of the war of the IEDs and the little bombs that you step on and blow your feet off was, I mean, that was like, that was the flavor of the war down there. I'd spent a few weeks in Paktika province with another battalion of the 101st Airborne Division, where they were in, it was a very high altitude fight, but it was much kind of more rolling hills, more vehicle mounted stuff, much less kind of vegetation. So I was really just trying to cover, a little bit of the flavor of what these different little wars were like for different units fighting around the country. But then it happened to be that the Petch was the one that kind of stuck with me and grabbed me, and that I continued to pay attention to. U.S. forces pull out of the Pesh in 2011, even as the surge is going on in the rest of the country. They kind of recognize that the very same counterinsurgency strategy has failed in the Pesh, and they pull out. And that kind of fascinated me and motivated me to keep an eye on the place and keep talking to people who had been there, and eventually pitch a book about the place that would give me the opportunity to go and dig into it really deeply.
John, I saw you shaking your head a lot as Wes has sort of imparted a lot of this knowledge to us. That you were on the ground, you were experiencing kind of the same things, and with the idea of the Pesh being, like as we've said, this very kinetic place, was there something, I want to say mythological about it, but very like the warrior mindset, like this is where the big boys go to play? And was there something about that within the units, like this is what we are meant to do as soldiers?
Absolutely. And one of the things, like he's talking about, like you don't get all that big picture at once, and very little info is passed from one unit to another. When I showed up there in 2006, said it was my brigade that built the COP in the Corn Gulf right next to the lumber yard. And it was saying, and we knew that the lumber trade was big there. We didn't know that we were being pulled into this lumber baroness feud that was going on there. But we knew the history of some of the stuff that had occurred in the years prior. So the year before, 2005, was when the lone survivor incident happened.
Operation Red Wings.
Yeah, Operation Red Wings. And the SEAL team was overrun and helicopter was shot down, all that. So we knew that, hey, these other guys have been getting into fights here. This is where the combat's at. Heck, this is where a SEAL team got rolled up. So obviously there's some professional fighters up here. Yeah, one of the first big missions I did in country in 2006 was Operation Mountain Lion. And that was trying to, with very few men, trying to isolate an entire region between the Pesh Valley and Asadabad to look for the same fighters that had rolled up the SEAL team the year prior. And it was because of the experiences of the units that had been in there previously. Some Marines, the SF teams, the SEAL team, Operation Red Wings, the year prior, that we were all fueled to go in there and fight. Because previous combats occurred here, previous high-level bad guys were here. This is where we got to go for the fight.
This may be like an odd question, and I may not phrase it the way it's coming out in my head, so I apologize, John, but it seems from hearing from both you and Wes, like there's a lot of stuff that not only we know, as people looking back at history, but also that there's a lot of stuff that like you guys, as you are serving, don't know or didn't know at the time. Now, is that just because of the nature of what you're doing, or is that kind of something intentional that you guys are only told about what you have to do to keep you focused on like the tasks that your unit is supposed to be doing? I mean, it just, I guess I'm still trying to wrap my head around the fact that there's so much that like people don't know still.
Right. It's a combination of both. Some of it, I feel they just don't want us to know, maybe a distraction, or maybe it's just not at our level. At the time, my experience is based off of being a, sergeant and staff sergeant and, running a sniper team, a kill team in 2006, 2007 there. But a lot of info isn't passed off from one unit to another because either, the unit that's rotating out, especially if they've been in heavy combat, their focus is on getting home safely. They've done their time, their 6 months, 9 months, year, whatever it is. So they want to get out of there. They're not trying to take any more risk. So they're trying to pass off a little bit of info, so you can replace them. And some of it just gets lost in translation. I remember after coming home from Afghanistan in 2007, I think it was the next year, 2008, I ended up picking up a book. I think it was called Victory Point. And it was about the Marines that served in the same area and some major combat that they were in. And this was all stuff that occurred the year before I was there, and I knew none of it. And they talked about all the intel that they had, all of these locations and places where I served at, and I knew none of it. And I, as a sniper team leader who was planning his own operations in that region, I would have loved to have had that info. And I had no idea that the Marines were doing similar things the year prior.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly true that a junior soldier, even an NCO, a platoon leader, a company commander, there's stuff that's not at their level, that's sort of just not passed down to them because they don't need it. But I would also say, do not underestimate the military's ability to forge ahead on false or wrong information at very high levels. I mean, it's really extraordinary. I mean, it's not extraordinary when you think about it. I mean, these are all well-meaning people, these generals and colonels and so on, who are doing the best with the information that they have. But I'm thinking of an example. I interviewed retired General Mick Nicholson, who was, as a colonel, was the brigade commander for John's brigade in 2006. Interviewed him a lot of times for the book because he's a pretty key figure in the Afghan war. He kept going back over and over again for different tours as a 1-star, as a 2-star, as a 4-star. He eventually was the 4-star commander of all U.S. troops in Afghanistan in 2016, 17, 18. And he made a really striking comment about Operation Mountain Lion, that April to May 2006 operation where the brigade came in, built the Korengal outpost, built these other, started the day-to-day presence of U.S. troops living in the Korengal. And he recalled a big meeting, a shura they called it, with the Korengal elders, with kind of representatives from all the different villages in the valley. Very early on, after he had hiked down from the Scuttlebutt mountain or flown down from the Scuttlebutt mountain to stop to visit the lumberyard as it was being turned into the Korengal outpost. And they had this big shura with all the elders. And what he told me later was, at that shura, we were sitting down with the elders of the insurgency, but we didn't know that at the time. We thought that they were being influenced by outsiders, by sort of bad guys coming in from other places who were coercing them, who were, preventing them from supporting the government. When in fact that wasn't the case at all. The Korengalis themselves were completely opposed to the United States and the government. And had every reason to present themselves as being coerced by outsiders, which is a line that U.S. units bought. They had to learn over time and at a cost that this was wrong. And then the next unit would have to relearn the same lesson. And this is something that you see particularly in the Korengal, is you see a series of units kind of having the realization that, oh, we're fighting the population of the valley here. We're not fighting outsiders who are coming in and making them do this and that. We're fighting the valley itself. And this is something that one would hope would really be something that units wouldn't have to relearn over and over again, but they did, because the military was very bad at passing down that kind of institutional knowledge.
With that in mind, I mean, we could go on for hours here. We have so much experience and knowledge here in this one Zoom room. But I do want to get to the idea of, in the hardest place. Are we looking at is this a tragic story? What are the successes? What are the failures that we've experienced as the U.S. and that you experienced as a reporter in that region?
I certainly think it's a tragic story. I think it's a really sad story. If you look at kind of the situation that exists there today, there is a narrow ribbon of territory along the Pesh Valley floor and the Weigel Valley floor that the government controls, and they control it pretty firmly. They've built a ton of little outposts up there, the Afghan government. Within that little ribbon of territory, I think there are improvements that exist in people's lives that weren't there 20 years ago. There are cell phone towers. There's, because of the paved road that was paved with U.S. money, there's commerce of various types that didn't exist 20 years ago. If you go a mile or two off, even less than a mile off that little ribbon of road, and go up into the villages in the mountains where a pretty significant proportion of the population lives, that's all Taliban country now, and in some cases ISIS country. And the Taliban and ISIS are groups that really did not exist in Kunar for the most part before 9/11. I mean, certainly ISIS didn't; it didn't exist at all. And so, when you talk to Kunaris and Nuristanis about the legacy of U.S. involvement up there, there's a lot of bitterness and sadness. There's a lot of feeling that the U.S. made big promises about reconstruction and road building that it either never fulfilled or it kind of fulfilled in an unsustainable way. It built roads that then couldn't be maintained. It built bridges that fell apart, things like that. And there's a lot of bitterness over kind of this legacy of having brought in, attracted these militants who weren't there before in this particular part of the country.
John, can you speak to any of the successes that you feel that your unit had while you were there?
That's really hard to say, because at that time, and even for the few years after, you would invest a lot of time, on the troop side, pulling security to ensure that, hey, we can provide safe construction for the school, for this road. We're going to provide safety for you to vote for your election, stuff like that. But, you build the school, the Taliban blows up the school. So it's just like all that time, pretty much for nothing, money for nothing. And as Wes just pointed out, really no like long-term sustainment of the stuff. Like, yeah, well, I'll help you build this road, but you don't got a road maintenance crew. I'm not funding you for that long. We poured a lot of money, a lot of work into it. And, for really some short-term objectives, I have a lot of friends who, are really upset that, like, we build a base and, 4 years later, you find out through a YouTube propaganda video that, the Taliban's reclaimed the base. Mm-hmm. That upsets some soldiers. It doesn't upset me. For me, it's more of a, I never had any realistic expectation of it being some like long-term foothold. Heck, I don't want us to have some long-term foothold there. Mm-hmm. I didn't go there to be like an invader and, that become a colony of America. Mm-hmm. But the longer you're there, the more attractive it was to the fighters. And you definitely saw, especially over the coming years, kind of starting with us building that presence in 2006 up through 2009, 2010, a lot of these bases are, attacked on really large scales, attempted to overrun. And it's because over those years, they built up this intelligence of the forces. We're building up, but they're learning from us. And they're getting better at their job, combating us, and it really led to some large scale stuff that, in the end, we just abandoned. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to say, like there's not a lot of like real good personal victory stuff there.
Wes, I have to ask you, hearing all of these stories for these years and talking to these people, and then, hearing John today and knowing how much light possibly your book has shed on what was happening in this area over all this time and the stories of, these people who were there fighting. I hate this question as a reporter, but I have to ask it in this situation. Like, how does that feel for you to see not only all of your research and experiences come together, but to be able to have other people read this information and the stories of these people that were over there fighting that we may never would have known? I mean, I may never have known this had I not met you.
Yeah, I mean, it's very satisfying. It's been a long time that I spent writing this book. I mean, the better part of a decade. Interviewed, more than 400 people for it. Read thousands and thousands of pages of documents. went over and embedded with U.S. troops, went over and embedded with Afghan troops after the Americans had left, all this stuff. So to then finally actually see the physical book is very satisfying. It's nice to see reviews, but what's even more satisfying than that is, to get feedback from veterans and from Afghans who say, well, this helps me understand better my little piece of the war. This helps me understand what happened before and after. And then the most kind of validating and satisfying thing is, when I get messages on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook or whatever from guys who fought up there who say, I bought a copy of this for my dad. I bought a copy of this for my wife. I bought a copy of this for my kid because I think it'll help them kind of understand my war. And that's an incredibly validating and moving thing, because that's sort of always what I had hoped this book would be able to do, was to help not only the people who fought up there, but the people around them, understand this war, which has affected so many more people than just the people who fought in it.
We started this program by talking about how the Scuttlebutt helps to try to bridge the military-civilian divide. I think that this episode is one of our strongest in this instance, especially for our generation who have dealt with the Afghan war, which will be, quote unquote, ending on September 11th when we pull all of the troops remaining in Afghanistan out of there, officially ending the war after 20 years. And I feel like, Wes, that you're in a very unique position with this idea of bridging the divide, that, you're a civilian, you were there, you can bring back these stories through the hardest place. I have it in audio, I have it in Kindle, and I really want to have it in physical format because I just like having something to hold. Where can I get this book, a physical copy?
Anywhere books are sold. I mean, if there's a Barnes and Noble, or even better, an independent bookseller in your town, I mean, that's the place to go to pick it up. You can obviously order it on Amazon or bookshop.org or wherever else. But yeah, I mean, it's got some nice maps in it, some nice photos that also I think come through a little better in the hard copy. I'm pretty addicted to Kindle books myself. But yeah.
I do like, because you have a lot of footnotes in the book, and I do like on the Kindle where you can just tap a number, jump to the end of the book, read about how you researched this piece, and then pop right back to the beginning. But I highly recommend The Hardest Place if you are interested in learning more about not only the Afghan war, or if you're part of the post 9/11 generation, you want to understand more about this. Wes, did you ever actually reconnect with the reporter who came to your middle school and sort of sparked this passion in you?
Yeah, I have. I've encountered her a couple more times over the years. And it's funny, actually, also another person who went to the same middle school and was best friends with her was Sebastian Junger, the guy who wrote War and did Restrepo. So there's a funny little connection there.
There's more and more being written about this war, and there's really a lot of places that you can go to kind of see the sites. Korengal, Restrepo, both of those documentaries are perfect if you really want to dive in with a unit with Sebastian Junger. You really want to get a really in-depth knowledge. Read Wes's book, The Hardest Place. As we mentioned, The Outpost. I'm sort of creating a library of these books and these stories to further inform myself and educate myself on what the Afghan war was and what is meant to soldiers and veterans over the past 20 years. John, any final thoughts?
No, Wes's book's definitely next on my list. I'm actually going to try to pick it up this afternoon. But I love the picture that it paints. And as I'm learning about it, and the research and just the continuation that it provides of the story. It's like, I have my 16-month experience in the region, from early 2006 to mid 2007, on the ground there. But to be able to learn about, I didn't know, I knew of Camp Blessin at the mouth of the Korengal. I think I flew into there once for like a refueling with the helicopter or something. That was my limited experience there, but I walked the mountains of the Korengal, stuff like that. But to be able to learn more of the history and what occurred thereafter, and eventually the U.S. pullout, I've been getting snippets of it from years, but to be able to have the conversation and be able to learn from Wes here, this has been fantastic.
Well, thank you. And Catherine, any final thoughts today?
Yeah, I just think that John and so many other men and women did their duty to serve and ultimately protect us. And Wes did an incredible job in researching that, and his duty and job to bring that information to people that would have otherwise not had it and educate the public. And I think it's our job as civilians and people who didn't live that military life to be aware of what goes on in the world in our lives. I mean, you talk about 20 years, that's a large chunk of my lifetime. So I think it's our due diligence as civilians to then educate ourselves so that we know what everybody went through and the effort that people took to get that information to us. So I would just encourage everyone to not only read Wes's book, but learn. I mean, there's so much that I learned today that I wouldn't have known, and it opened my eyes a lot. So just everybody, do our due diligence and research and learn a little bit.
I was going to say, I mean, if I could just make, one final point. I mean, it's a long book. It's like 500 pages of text and then a bunch of endnotes and so on. If that seems like kind of a lot and you're not sure whether you want to pick it up, or there have been various excerpts that have been published in different places. There was one in the Atlantic last month that was pretty well timed with President Biden's pullout decision. And also, I've been doing a thread on Twitter that I've been updating every day. That's just photos from the PESH, not my photos, but everybody else's photos who've sent them in. Because the book only had room in a little photo insert for like 25 photos, something like that. But in the course of interviewing so many Americans and Afghans with connections to this place, people have sent me thousands of phenomenal photos. And so what I've been doing is, just every day since the book came out, I've been posting a few more photos, just kind of working my way forward in time from photos of the Soviet experience up there in the 1980s, which is what I start with, up to right now. I had just been posting some photos from John's brigade and their experience in 2006, 2007. So yeah, I mean, check it out on Twitter. I mean, my handle is Wesley S. Morgan on Twitter. And it'll be the first thing you see under my name. But if you want to kind of just get a taste of kind of what the place looks like, some of the themes, and then decide, oh, maybe this book's interesting, maybe it's not. That could be a good place to start.
I'm just going to go ahead and say that it's very interesting, and I'm going to say our audience should definitely pick it up. I know that I was hooked right from the start. I want to thank you all for joining us on the Scuttlebutt, and I want to thank the audience for listening in. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and reach out to us with any comments or thoughts that you might have. Usually we have a mail call where we want to read some of the comments that we receive. But thank you all again, and we look forward to seeing you all soon on another episode of the Scuttlebutt. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us for another episode of the Scuttlebutt. I want to thank D&D Metal Recycling and Auto Salvage for their generous support and sponsorship of this program. You can find their locations, get quotes, and ask about availability at D&Dautosalvage.com. That's D&Dautosalvage.com. We'll see you next week here on the Scuttlebutt.